All right, there's going to be part two, 1.5. Not too much how to, but update on the SX500 that I'm building with my kids. We have a little light to clamp on. The far driver, as you can see, is mounted there inside the stock battery covers. Things that we're having an issue with, getting pressure in the rear brake. There's some pressure, not a ton. We're going to go through that. Extended kickstand, took off the Tao race bike. Other things that were noticed, shimming with the underslung pit bike rear caliper. The spacing had to be customized, so in doing that I noticed that it kind of puts the chain out of alignment slightly. It's resting more on towards the motor, so we're going to re-shim that by replacing the outer shim and the inner shim with a washer on the outside. Remove that shim and put a washer on the inside, the wheel side as well. That the two washers combined for the 3 millimeters. They're both about 1.5 millimeter, so that should work out and push the wheel over just enough. Well, we'll see. Next we are putting on a battery monitor. That's pretty straightforward. Just had a clamp, spare piece of not real carbon. And let's talk about the brakes. So the front brakes, if you want to do a big brake kit, you can buy this rotor from 73 Motor Parts, or you can go on eBay and look for this part number. It's for a Suzuki GS 550 or something like that, rear brake, but it mounts up perfectly. Got to get a couple more bolts to mount the rotor. It's an Arashi DBS 2013W. So over here we have our fork mounts. These are the standard generic pit bike forks. Anybody can buy them from Amazon, eBay. There's a handful of guys that specialize in them. The thing is, these are 43 millimeter spacings. So with that, you will need a bracket, a radial mount adapter that's also 43 millimeters. So that bracket will be mounted up to the bike, and then from there we can throw on our caliper. The hardware that comes with that is right here. So that will mount the standard mount and convert it to radial. Let's talk about the brakes. So this is a RPM Racing Caliper that matches up with this adapter with included hardware. So when you do buy, you need to buy this bracket, probably separate. And this one has the spacing perfect for that 250 millimeter rotor. When you buy the caliper, it comes with a bleed, a secondary bleeder that goes on top of the provided banjo bolt. The pitch on these banjo bolts, if you don't want to use a secondary bleeder, it's a M10 by 1.25. And then you'll simply mount the caliper through the backside and into the mount. So now we'll talk about the master cylinder. This is an Adelin 14 millimeter piston. It's radial as well, so you want to match radial with radial versus standard. The stainless steel brake lines are available on eBay, Amazon, AliExpress, whatever. I like to have the quick release so that I can, without disassembling the whole thing, I can pop off my brake lines. Can't do it with one hand, but this does come off quite easily. They look like, I have another one somewhere, like this. So it's a two-piece set. We're going to be putting all this stuff on today. I'm going to do a bench bleed, and I will be doing a reverse bleed. So I just basically suck fluid into this giant massive syringe. I will put it onto the primary bleed nipple, push it from the bottom. This will be up, and then until it releases, loosen the cap, it will push the brake fluid all the way through from the bottom up. All right, brake fluid. This is cheap .4 brake fluid. Always have a Sharpie handy. The date, whenever you open your brake fluid, you want to write that date in. The stuff does not last forever. If I don't use it in about a month, it goes out. You also are going to notice we do have an Amorge 72 volt 24 amp hour battery. We will be replacing the Shrimp Depot battery in the very near future. I got my tools. I always like to line out my tools, and then I'm going to show you how I assemble the caliper. I can't do it with one hand, so I'll make short videos on how I get the caliper assembled and then mounted to the bike. First thing I'm going to do is assemble the bleed valve to the banjo bolt. So this is going to go inside, just like that. That'll be tightened down with my little thing there. And then I'm also going to be placing the banjo bolt through, obviously, my brake line over here. And that'll go in just like this. So that gives me a secondary bleed valve. All right. So first thing I always do is I like to assemble my bleed valve onto my M10 by 1.25 banjo bolt, just like that, using an 8mm on the bleeder and a 14 on the banjo bolt. Next, we're going to take our brake line and we're going to attach it to the caliper with the provided banjo bolt. All right, so I'm going to take this. I'm not going to use for my banjo connector. I'm not going to use the provided little gaskets because they're so thick with the rubber that it only gives me a few threads into the caliper. So I'm going to use my, which I have a ton of these, copper and aluminum crush gaskets. I'm going to go one on the banjo bolt. Put your brake line or brake line adapter in my case, and then a secondary crush gasket. That gives me a little bit more meat when I go into my caliper. Just like that. Okay, next part's a little bit tricky. When assembling, I put my bolts in so I can see what kind of clearance I'm going to get when I'm pointing my brake line. And if I want it to go inside and route it that way, or outside, then I use my 14mm wrench and tighten down the banjo bolt, kind of lock it in place, ensuring that I have clearance to get an Allen wrench in there and actually attach it to the adapter. Now it's time to get the adapter mounted to the fork leg. So using these are 14mm, and we're just going to mount the adapter first. We'll get these snugged down. Then when they're all tightened down, we'll be ready to mount our caliper. It'll be bolted in just like that around the rotor. After you get the mount on, you're going to mount the caliper with the bolts right through there. Again, it's radial mount, so everything goes in through the side, which is, if you're a motorcycle guy, you know that this is the newer technology opposed to the older standard mount. So we'll get these bolts with an M6 Allen, or X, whatever you want to call it, mounted down just like that, and you'll get these snugged on. Then we're going to move on to mounting our line. Now, if your line is already on your caliper and you're not using a quick connect, then your line's going to be just shooting off, hanging out in the wind right now. Okay, at this point we would have our caliper mounted. Our brake line would be hanging out. You're gonna bring your brake line up, obviously mount your master lever over here, get everything connected up. I already had this already kind of pre-assembled. But outside of finishing off and bleeding out your master cylinder, if you haven't, I'm going to do a bench bleed and get all of this. I'm going to reverse bleed. But from this point on, it would just be pretty much making sure that you're bleeding for good brake pressure. And that's it. So that's going to be the 250 millimeter Big Brake with the RPM caliper and a Adelin 14 millimeter master cylinder on the SX500.